recording. Here we go. This is session number, believe it or not, 43 of Old Testament survey. We are working our way through the Bible, beginning at Genesis, and we'll go all the way to Malachi. Believe it or not, we're rapidly coming to the conclusion of our time together in Old Testament. I'm moving quickly through some of the prophets because their message is often very much the same thing. The prophets frequently have a contemporary judgment message, that is, a message of condemnation on either Israel and Judah, or the people of Israel and Judah, and sometimes the surrounding nations, that is immediate. And those we can just mention. The thing that they all have in common, the prophecies of condemnation that were to take place in the immediate time frame of the prophet, were all literally fulfilled in history. Some of them are more difficult to come up with evidence for than others, and frankly, I don't find that a fascinating study. I've gone through all of that once and gone as far as I needed to with each of the condemnations. There's about 200 of them. And what we find is that for the most part, history concludes that the prophecies were literally fulfilled. So a principle that we can draw from that is that Old Testament prophecies, even those that don't have to do with the first coming of Christ, if they have been fulfilled, have been literally fulfilled. The prophecies are meant as historical object lessons of the either the wrath of God or of the blessing of God. And it can go either way. The point of that, the reason that I continue to emphasize that fact is because so many of the critics assume that God can't predict the future with any accuracy. And so all of it has to be understood either as metaphor for the immediate problem, or some of them argue that predictive prophecy is impossible, therefore the prophets had to live after the time. I believe, one, that God knows the end from the beginning because he is the creator. It's his world, it's his universe, he's doing this. And secondly, he has a purpose, a plan in all of history that he is working out, and he reveals those plans to the prophets. And then the most important, I think, future prophecies that appear to be unfulfilled at this point in history, related primarily to the events around the second coming of Christ, will also be literally fulfilled. Now, that's important from a faith point of view. For the strengthening of our faith, we need to understand that God always does what he promises. And that's a good thing for us to be reminded of. From a practical point of view, it's not terribly helpful. Okay, from a practical viewpoint, it really doesn't matter much whether the rapture happens at the beginning or the end of the tribulation period. It really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter who the Antichrist is. If we need to know, we'll find out. But the Bible gives us those details and in enough places and with enough variety that it's apparently worthwhile to spend some time looking at the details. Again, I don't see the doctrine of last things as doing a whole lot for us practically. We're never going to be able to predict which particular wars or rumors of wars, which particular earthquakes are the biblical signs. We'll never know until after it's all done. And then perhaps it will be clear. But along the way, it's a good exercise for us to get a clear view of what God really has planned. We can see the overall structure of this. So let's launch into, let's see what I'm launching into here. I need to start with the little book of Lamentations. And in order to get there, I'm going to have to share the screen. Let's do that. And we're going to do this. And then we're going to do this. Okay. Ooh, look at there. It worked first time. Sometimes it doesn't. This time it did. The little book of Lamentations comes right after Jeremiah. And so we include this in the prophetic literature. And this little book is anonymous. In other words, it doesn't claim to be written by anybody. But long Jewish tradition attributes the book to Jeremiah. So we traditionally put Jeremiah and Lamentations together in all of our Bibles. The Hebrew Bible has had it together for so long that when a scroll of Jeremiah is found all by itself, it invariably includes Lamentations. So there's no good reason to believe that anybody else wrote the book. The most recent commentator, believe it or not, the most recent commentator to argue against Jeremiah's authorship of the Book of Lamentations is a Dutchman by the name of Hart in 1712 of all times. So it's not a recent critique. The book must have been written in a fairly narrow time frame. In between the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 and Jeremiah's exile to Egypt, which had to have been around 582 BC. So it's a fairly narrow range. Zedekiah's revolt, the last king of Israel, resulted in a revolt. The Babylonians put a character by the name of Gedaliah in as governor. Gedaliah revolted again, and Jerusalem was destroyed in 586. Then Gedaliah himself was assassinated in probably 583, 582, sometime in there. So the invasion by the Babylonians resulted in the utter destruction by fire of each of the walled cities of Judah. They were just all reduced to rubble. Today, when we study that, we find the archaeological evidence is overwhelming. This was a terrible, truly awful destruction, and all of them by fire. And this is anybody who still happened to be alive and hadn't been dragged off into captivity is here. A large number of people, probably not the majority, but a very large number of people, the nobility and the middle class, and as many of the peasants as could get up and walk, were carried off to Babylon, where they set up a series of colonies in the Mesopotamian Valley. And that community, very large community, continued to live in Babylon and then under Persian rule until Persia became Iran in 1943 or so. And then Iran, of course, declared war against Israel when it was proclaimed in 1948. And all of the Jews, some 500,000 of them, who lived in Mesopotamia, in Persia, in what was then Iran and Iraq, were forced out of their homes. They were given no time to carry anything with them, and they became refugees. Many of those people came to the United States. Many of them came to places in Europe where it was possible for them to start over. Some of them went into Russia, which was not a great idea, but that's where some of them belonged. And a very large number, 250,000 or so, came to Israel to help with the founding of the new state. And all of those people have found new homes and new identities, and they've become a productive part of the modern world. That's what happens with refugees all through history. And it's always a sad thing when people are forced out of their homes by war or by other kinds of conflicts. But generally speaking, the world goes on and stuff happens. Jeremiah is lamenting the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the society of Judah. This little book is kind of grim. Let me tell you a little bit about the literary structure of the book. It's a series of 5 chapters, which are funeral dirges. A dirge is a song sung or played in the minor key as a part of a funeral, sometimes in the form of a march, the funeral march, as the body is being carried to the grave. So not a happy sort of a music at all. The lament was used at funerals, obviously. There's 2 outstanding signs of the lament. You can always tell when you're reading a Hebrew lament. There's one, you've got the word alas or woe. The Hebrew is ekah. And the other is the metric form, the rhythm of the verse. This is called the kana pattern. And it puts 3 beats in the first part and 2 beats in the second part. Bum, 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 ba, 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 bum, bum. It sort of limps. It's a hollow, incomplete sound to the work. And it's easy to recognize when you hear it. The other thing that's fascinating about Lamentations is that it's set up as a series of acrostics. So there are 22 verses in each of chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5. Chapter 3 has twice as many verses, got 66, 3 times as many, 66 verses. And those verses each start out with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is fascinating and very difficult. We call this the acrostic. Chapter 3 is the climax chapter, and so it's the longest chapter. 3 verses with each letter. And then chapter 5, strangely enough, skips the acrostic arrangement. We don't know why exactly, but it's interesting. The balance of the chapters is fascinating. just from a literary point of view. Chapters 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 are generally thought to be parallel to one another. And then chapter 3, the climactic chapter, is the longest chapter, and it forms the fulcrum. This is what we call the pivot for a chiasm. I'll show you the pattern here. When we look at the outline of the book, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we see chapter 3 in the middle, 1 and 5. The desolation because of sin, the Lord's response to sin. God's punishment of Jerusalem's sin paralleled with the Lord's anger. And Jeremiah's response is this long chapter, chapter 3. There's some parts of the book that are really good, but most of it is actually quite difficult. I want to read just one bit, 3, beginning at verse 19, because of the pattern of Jeremiah's lament. Remember my affliction and my wandering, beginning at verse 19, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind. Now, Jeremiah moves on. He says, I'm coming through this terrible time. I hate the memory of this awful thing that has happened to my city, but this I call to mind. In other words, here is what gives me something to believe in. This I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. Just one thing I want you to notice about this. I mean, it's a great passage. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. That's just great. And that's a memory verse if we ever had one. But look at the pattern here. Jeremiah emphasizes that when I think of these things, when I think of what God has done in Israel and in my life, I have hope. Because the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Love lasts. Love covers a multitude of sins. Love is God's active response to his people. And finally, God is faithful. Faith, hope, and love. Paul uses that same triad in the New Testament to measure the maturity of the church. We can think of God as being the faithful one who gives root to our faith, the hope giver who lays the foundation of our hope, as the faithful one who is the foundation of our faith. We can have faith and hope and a love for one another and for God because God has first loved us and has first been faithful to us. This pattern is not merely a Pauline pattern, it's a biblical pattern. And so when we're looking to describe God, we describe him in terms of his faithfulness, his hopeful foundation, and his loving kindness, his faithful love. It's all good, as my son likes to say. Okay, I'm going to quit with Lamentations. That's my favorite verse in Lamentations. There are some others that are important, but we'll go on. And this one is hard to find. We're going to move over to the little book of Nahum. Nahum is this little guy. The word Nahum uh, means something like consolation. If you're looking for Nahum and you found the book of Jeremiah, that's pretty easy. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations. Then comes Ezekiel, that's followed by Daniel. Once you get past Daniel, you'll find all of these little minor prophets. Hosea, Joel, Amos. Okay, Hosea, Joel, Amos. Followed by Jonah, Micah, and Nahum. So he's the sixth book of the minor prophets. And I'm just looking at my slide here. I have the name Nahum written twice. That may not come through on your screen. I don't know. Okay. We know nothing about the man personally. Tradition has it that he lived along the Sea of Galilee in the town on that little spit of land there, which is called, strangely enough, Capernaum. In a lot of New Testament teachers will call this something like Capernaum or Capernaum or something like that. But Kephar means village, and Nahum, of course, is the prophet Nahum. So the Capernaum, the village of Nahum. And it's a fishing village where we know Jesus made his headquarters. Jesus and the disciples made their headquarters at the household of Peter's mother-in-law, and that was right next door to the synagogue there in Capernaum. Nahum himself probably lived there. The practice in the ancient world was for names to move around, so it may be somewhere nearby here, probably by the Sea of Galilee. Historically, the date of Nahum is bounded by the fall of Thebes, which probably happened about 663 BC, and the fall of Nineveh, which happened around 612 BC. And I know this is just before the captivity, but it's all right. Nahum describes the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, at the height of its power, which would have been probably before 626 BC. Nahum describes Judah as under subjugation of Assyria, which would put it in the reign of Manasseh, better than under the reign of Josiah. Thebes was rebuilt in 654, a date for Nahum between 663 and 654 is likely. We go through that because that's the historical data we actually have, and sometimes it's handy to have a date that we can assign to these things. We know something about Assyria. They were a protection racket. They would come around and intimidate peaceful cities and threaten them with destruction if they didn't pay tribute. That was their way of operating. Here in the U.S., there are vicious mobs in some of our big cities who will go to the big corporations and tell them, if you don't give us money and support our work, we will burn down your buildings in this city. That's the same thing. It's a protection racket, and it's not valid protest. It's just a protection racket. And Nineveh and the people of Assyria, well, the leaders of Assyria, were a genuinely evil crowd. What they did was really, really wrong. Assyria was never really an empire. It never attempted to put together a unified government or an economic system. Very likely the first real world empire in anything like the modern sense of the word was Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. This is a uniting of a widespread group of individual nation states. into a single governmental unit with some kind of representation to the capital and a unified economic system, so that there was more or less a level playing field for everybody that wanted to do something productive. It wasn't capitalism by any means, but it was a unified economic system, obviously to benefit the king, but still there were benefits all around. Roads, a postal system, an army to provide peace. There were some real advantages to the Babylonians coming to power. Nebuchadnezzar is the one who destroyed Assyria, and that's what we're going to be looking for in Nahum. The purpose of Nahum is to describe the judgment and destruction of Nineveh and the kingdom of Assyria, and it lays out into three quick chapters. Excuse me for coughing. The book starts out, an oracle concerning Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum of Elkosh. Okay, otherwise we don't know anything about it. The judgment on Nineveh is declared in chapter 1. It's described in chapter 2. It's well deserved in chapter 3. The fulfillment of the prophecies of the book of Nahum are found historically. The book describes the fall of the city of Nineveh, and that's exactly what happened. It happened just like you would think it would happen. The calamity of the city of Nineveh is described in the latter part of chapter 1. Chapter 2 continues to describe the fall of Nineveh. It'll be captured, plundered, destroyed. The reasons for Nineveh's judgment are laid out in chapter 3. She's a bloodthirsty nation. Her immorality and idolatry are legendary. Her pride in not learning from the fall of other nations, which were equally evil, but much smaller. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Nahum. What I'd like us to understand is that God uses the ongoing flow of the historical process to judge nations that he desires to bring down. Some nations rise up and they act as judges on other nations. This happens in the form of wars and invasions and miscellaneous intimidations, all kinds of bad things. And the reminder here is that God is at work in the processes of the world's history. The historical process doesn't take God by surprise. When nations rise up and do evil, it is not something that God scratches his head about. He understands that. And sometimes the evil of men is used by God as a form of judgment, sometimes on his own people. So Nahum helps us to have a larger picture of what's happening in history, but not a whole lot of future. There's nothing about the first coming of Christ. There's nothing about the second coming of Christ here, except for us perhaps to learn that the underlying history of the world is going to make a big difference no matter what. Okay, the very next book after Nahum is Habakkuk. And those of you who were with me when did we begin this? March? We actually did Romans and then Habakkuk. Uh, Habakkuk was a lot of fun. I enjoyed going verse by verse through Habakkuk. Uh, don't ask me why I picked this particular photograph for the background of Habakkuk. I thought that this little kid here in the middle would make an excellent Habakkuk. The I thought he was adorable. All those kids coming home from school, and there they are. Okay, the little book of Habakkuk. We don't know very much about Habakkuk. This is true of the minor prophets in general. His name means to embrace. What he embraced or who he was embraced by is not known. We just don't know. There are as many ideas about Habakkuk's name as there are commentaries. So, we can have some fun with that. We don't know much about him. We don't know where he's from. It's just there he is. This little book was clearly written shortly after the death of Josiah. Habakkuk may have been involved in Josiah's reforms. He may not. The setting of the book is about the same as the setting of Jeremiah. It's a period of political instability. The religious situation is close to rock bottom. It doesn't get any worse. People generally refuse to hear the truth. So a pretty dark time. The purpose and theme of the book is to introduce the problem. How is it that God can use the ungodly to judge his chosen people? And Habakkuk comes to the conclusion that God is holy and infinitely powerful. The book of Habakkuk is laid out fairly easily into 3 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 take us into Habakkuk's problems. He's got 2 complaints, 2 problems. The first problem in verses 1 through 11, oh Lord, everything is really bad, and God answers him. So we get the first few verses. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear, or cry to you violence and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? Why do you look idly at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, justice never goes forth. The wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. And how many times in all of history have believers looked at the societies that they're a part of and said things like this? I think believers are always going to be dissatisfied with the overall secular culture that we're a part of. There's so frequently the secular world just doesn't care about God's principles, would never follow them if they knew them. It's virtually worthless to try to teach them. They don't want to know. And because of that, the societal standards tend to deteriorate. Even well-founded nations slowly deteriorate once they become rich and lazy. It has happened over and over again throughout history. So things are bad, things are violent, things are paralyzed, justice never happens the way it ought to. And so the answer from God, beginning at verse 5 through 11, look among the nations and behold, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you wouldn't believe if I told you. Behold, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, and boy, are they mean. Okay, the Chaldeans and the Babylonians are the same people group. And we've seen them before. This is all coming, we're coming from a variety of different angles. Habakkuk's problem, as we get into his second complaint in chapter 1, beginning at verse 12, is that God seems to be intending to use an evil nation to judge the chosen people. How can God do a thing like that? Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We're not going to die, are we? O Lord, you've ordained them as judgment. O Rock, you've established them. But you are of purer eyes than to see evil. You can't look at wrong. So this is a problem for Habakkuk, and the answer is in chapter 2, beginning at verse 2. The Lord answered me and said this, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that he may run who reads it. Okay, having read the message, the messenger will run to take the message to everyone. For the vision still awaits its appointed time. It's still future, just wait for it. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. When God makes a promise, and it seems to take a while for that promise to come true, the message is, wait for it. God is faithful. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Verse 4, behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. That's the unrighteous nation. That's the Babylonians. Now remember, God is using the Babylonian Empire first to destroy Nineveh. That's the message of Nahum. And now to destroy Judah. It will come down to the actual destruction of the city of Jerusalem itself by this genuinely evil people. Now, I think the Babylonians were much better on a historical scale than the Assyrians. I think the Assyrians were about as bad as they come. But the Babylonians were a close second. They were not nice people. And what they did was, in fact, evil. But they were less evil than the Assyrians. That's not an excuse. God says their heart is not right within them. They too, the Babylonians, are going to be used as a judge against Israel, but they too will eventually be judged. His soul is puffed up. His heart is not right within him. But the second part of verse 4, very, very important verse, quoted 3 times in the New Testament. This is such an important verse. But the righteous shall live by his faith. The righteous is who? That's the people of Israel who are what is left of the remnant, the righteous remnant of Israel. Believers who have given their hearts to God and therefore belong to God. The righteous are the saved people of the Old Testament. So Habakkuk ought to count himself among the righteous. God is not here telling Habakkuk what he needs to do to be saved. He is telling him what he, as a saved man, needs to do in a time of trial. Now, over in the New Testament, we develop in some detail the principle of justification by faith. And I'm not going to walk through all of that today. But in Romans and Galatians, Ephesians, the principle of justification by faith. Our salvation is by the grace of God, received by faith. So the grace of God reaches down. We respond with faith. God's response to our faith is justification. At that point, we have been declared righteous. So there is a faith that comes before righteousness. Now what Habakkuk is receiving is the message of the faith that comes after righteousness. How shall a righteous man continue to live? He shall live by his faith. We often call this faithfulness. God is faithful in the sense that he always keeps his promises. Believers are called to be faithful in that we are called to continue to live by our faith in spite of the obstacles that surround us. There's slightly different emphases, but it's the same word. So here, Habakkuk is being told things are going to get bad, they're going to get worse. The nation is going to be destroyed. Many, many people are going to die. The righteous man in this horrible time must live faithfully, must trust God, and continue to walk by faith in spite of the difficulties, knowing that God has called us and God is working in our lives. Okay, so that's the answer. And this from this point on, we go on through a series of parables of judgment, then on to chapter 3, which is Habakkuk's response to all of this. 3:2 is one of my favorite verses. O Lord, I've heard the report of you and of your work, O Lord. I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So Habakkuk says, Lord, it would be so nice if in the midst of this judgment, you could remember mercy. If you could remember what you have done in the past and maybe do it again. And yet if that doesn't happen, verse 17, 3:17, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor there be fruit on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the God of my salvation. I love that. I love that. When we look out at the general bad news in the morning paper, nothing but bad news that seems to surround us, it should give us some hope that God knows what's going on. He has control over the world. And more than that, he has us as individuals in the palm of his hand. Nothing bad can happen to us without God's permission. And when that bad thing happens, our job is to walk by faith through it. God doesn't always save us from the bad things, but he will always save us through it. And that's the message of Habakkuk. I find it very encouraging. The worse things get in the world, the more I find that Habakkuk becomes my favorite book. Okay, I want to just barely bump into the book of Ezekiel. Seems like that's the next one in line. Yes, here comes Ezekiel. There's a moonlit Mount of Olives picture to give us a little background here. Who was Ezekiel? Of the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Ezekiel probably writes the latest. He was his name means something like God is strong, or Chazak Yel. Don't worry about that one. We don't have him anywhere else in the Bible. He just isn't mentioned. We know he was a priest. His father's name was Buzzy, He was born sometime around 622 or so BC. We know that he was exiled to Babylon as a very young man, and he lived amongst the exiles by the Kebar River before he began his ministry at the age of 30. So probably about 592 BC is when he begins. We know that Ezekiel was married, but his wife died during the siege of Jerusalem. So Ezekiel has a tough life. He's living in exile. His job is to preach to the first generation of exiles, people who have been sent into captivity because of their sin. So this is not a great beginning. Historically, the date of the prophecy is clearly the period between 592 to 570 BC. So just shortly later than Jeremiah, a different focus. Jeremiah spoke to the city of Jerusalem itself during the fall. Ezekiel spends his whole life essentially in exile in Babylon. The first deportation took place in 606. That's when Daniel was taken, and we'll get to Daniel probably next week. Ezekiel and Daniel most likely were acquainted with one another. Very likely both of them had copies or access to the book of Jeremiah. They both knew the prediction of the 70 weeks. The second deportation took place in 597 BC, and that's when Ezekiel went. He should be considered a part of the middle class of Israel. And he began his prophecy at the age of 30 years old, 5 years after his captivity began. So he spoke to the colony of captives, while Jeremiah spoke to Jerusalem, and Daniel spoke in the royal court of Nebuchadnezzar. So all three of them, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Daniel, were active at about the same time during the Babylonian captivity, but in different places, in different ways. The key thing that I'm going to emphasize in the book of Ezekiel, and this is where we're going to end up today, is the concept of the 3 clocks of prophecy. That thing in the background is a chess clock. Now, people who play chess with a clock use 2 little clocks. And you'll notice on the top of the clock, there's a little button over the top of each clock. And when you push the button, it stops the clock and starts the other clock. So when you're playing chess on the clock, and you're thinking about your move and getting ready to play, to move your piece, your clock is ticking. So only 1 clock at a time is ticking. When we think of the 3 clocks of prophecy, there are 2 clocks that are ticking, and 1 clock that runs the whole time. And I call these 3 clocks the clocks of the nations, of Israel, and of the church. The clock of the nations is sometimes called the time of the Gentiles. The clock of Israel is usually called the 70 weeks. And the clock of the church fits in between the 69th and the 70th weeks of Daniel. I'm going to use the whiteboard to draw a picture of this. I'll see if we can make this work. Here we go. If we have let's see, what's a good color here? I think I'll use blue. Okay, there's a timeline. And a good place to begin is by setting up a time for the crucifixion. We'll call it 28 AD. It may be a little different than that, but 28 is a nice round number. If we look back in history, we're going to find some other dates that are important. The first clock that I want to lay out for you is the clock of Daniel, 70 weeks. The 70 weeks of Israel are laid out in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, 70 sevens, which is sevens of years. If you multiply 70 times 7, you come up with 490. Subtract 7 from that to get 69, which is how many there are. You get 69 weeks from the going forth of a decree to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. The date on that is 445 BC. Right now, I'm not going to justify all of my dates. These are close. For all practical purposes, this is the way it works out. But Daniel 9 only speaks of 69 weeks between 445 and the crucifixion, after which Messiah is cut off and will have nothing. And then we're told that there is a 70th week yet to come. The 70th week is a time of trouble. And we can call this the tribulation. The tribulation ends with the second coming. Second coming of Christ. And after that is the kingdom age. So this is a standard pattern in Old Testament prophecy. The time of judgment here, the time of blessing here. This is also called the day of the Lord, and we understand that. There is a gap between the 69th and the 70th week, because there has to be. The 70th week is obviously still future. The events described in that time period, and we'll get to that in Daniel, have not happened yet. So all of this is the clock of Israel. The Israel clock stops at the crucifixion. There is no kingdom age at that time. And the Israel clock stops and the church age begins. The church age only continues up to the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. The most important argument for the pre-tribulational rapture of the church is right here. The distinction between Israel and the church. Okay, here we have Israel, and here we have the church, and these two are different. God has different plans for Israel and the church, and their clocks run differently. We expect that the church age will climax with two things: a great apostasy, and secondly, the technology to take the gospel to the uttermost parts of the earth. When I look at scholarly work that's being done in biblical studies and theology today, and look at the widespread apostasy within the academic world and within the church as a whole, I'm discouraged until I remember that God has promised that there would be an apostasy at the end. And the other thing is the ability to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. Only within essentially my lifetime has this become possible. What we're doing right now, as I'm lecturing here in Idaho, which is, for heaven's sakes, the ends of the earth, and I'm simultaneously speaking to friends in the Philippines and in Italy. We are at this moment reaching the uttermost parts of the earth. And people all over the world are doing the same thing right now. It's entirely possible. Uh, my son Stephen, who's listening now, is going to be involved with missionary aviation, taking the gospel to the uttermost parts, the hardest to reach places. The technology exists for the first time in all of history. I believe that means that we're approaching the end. If we look at the Israel clock, Israel is back in the land and is functioning as an independent nation. That leaves us with the third clock of prophecy, which I believe is the time of the Gentiles. Time of the Gentiles begins with Nebuchadnezzar's control over Jerusalem in 606 BC, and it ends with the second coming of Christ. Okay, the time of the Gentiles. This is the time of the nations. This is the time when the nations will control Jerusalem. Jesus says in Luke 22 that the desolation of Jerusalem will continue as Jerusalem is trodden under by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is complete. So we can see from that that the time of the Gentiles will end with the second coming of Christ. That's Luke 22. The beginning point has to be clear back here in 606 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar began to control Jerusalem. Throughout all of this time, there have been Gentile powers. First Babylon, then Persia, then what I call the Greco-Roman power, followed by Islam. Islam at the end will divide up into 10 toes or 10 heads, and the Antichrist will take his place. That all happens here during the tribulation period. These four great powers, 3, 4, form the structure of prophetic history. This is what God is doing with the world. Ezekiel is going to lay out details of the Israel clock and of the time of the Gentiles clock. So enough of that. I'm going to see if I can make this go away. Click. Okay, stop that share. I think I'm going to stop there. On Wednesday, we're going to launch into the study of Ezekiel proper. Ezekiel is a tough book. I like Ezekiel a bunch. My wife and I don't argue about this. She really likes Jeremiah. I like Jeremiah too. Jeremiah does an awful lot of really good stuff. But Ezekiel is laying out a more detailed structure of the end times. He's a little harder to understand, that there are big chunks of Ezekiel that I really enjoy. So we'll come back to Ezekiel on Wednesday. Let me get everybody unmuted here. There we go. So we can say hi to everybody. Donna can't be here today. Hey guys, see ya. Love y'all.
Yeah.
We can hardly wait to see everybody in person. We can't wait till the next time we can get to Italy. And that won't be until after the travel bans are taken care of. But we will get there. And we're looking forward to our next time in the Philippines as well. Okay, where is, there's Becca, Rowena, and June. There's everybody. Okay, love you guys, and we'll see you all Bye-bye,
Well,
Oscar. Bye-bye, Joel. Bye-bye,
hey, good morning.
Mike, everybody.
But,
We'll see
that's
you
it.
again in just a bit. We'll see you again on Wednesday. Take care.
Yes.
Bye-bye.